You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Let's go up to North America real quick and let's appreciate something about what's going on there by taking a look at what is known as the Mississippian cultures. The people of Middle North America are going to create unique societies that are going to flourish first in the Ohio-Kentucky area between around 800 before the Common Era to about 600 AD. And these societies are going to be known as the Adena Hopewell Mississippian cultures. The Adena Hopewell Mississippian cultures. So when we take a look at the Mississippian culture, we can put up that particular slide where it says the Adena and the Hopewell, yes. These cultures created a series of variations on the same basic cultural tradition, but each civilization has their own historical creation. What they're going to do is borrow from each other's traditions. Now, the Adena constructed monuments of vast earthenworks, and they had circular monuments, and they cultivated pumpkins, squash, and sunflowers. And they honored the dead by building gigantic funeral mounds, and they developed a very complex ritual system. And because of their ornamental and ritual regalia, the Adena and the Hopewell had some links with Mesoamerica. They used copper, they wove cloth, they made elaborate pottery. The evidence suggests that they had a sophisticated level of technology and political and social organization. The evidence also suggests that since they domesticated what is known as the goosefoot, the sunflower, and the amaranth prior to corn. Trade in corn comes from Mesoamerica and some archaeologists are still trying to interpret whether it came along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, out of Guatemala, or maybe the Southwest. But we'll deal with the Southwest in a little while. But others argue that the Hopewell received the corn from the Rio Grande. So let's go and let's appreciate the culture that's going to follow in the Mississippian cultures that are going to develop some very sophisticated societies. And one is in three societies. One is Aztlan and Itawa, and then the other Cahokia. But let's go to the north and let's appreciate Aztlan and Itawa. Because these societies are going to experience increases in population. There's an appearance of a ranked social organization. There's the establishment of corn as a major component in the diet, and there's intra-regional and extra-regional trade. These peoples were multilingual. Now, when we take a look at Aztlan, Aztlan is the name that's given to a trading center that developed in Wisconsin. And this is where Madison, Wisconsin sits today on the grid pattern of a place called Aztlan. And that is in North America, far north in America. There's another trading center that developed in a place known as Atlanta, Georgia today, and that is Itawa. And Itawa, again, is very important because Itawa was a place where people were multilingual, that they follow well-established land and water routes. They developed ball games played by different teams from different towns and eventually became the game of lacrosse. Games were accompanied by elaborate ceremonies, dances, rigorous training, and prizes. But most importantly, warfare. Warfare was likewise also an important activity. Then there's one of the most important trading centers that's a part of St. Louis today, and that trading center is known as Cahokia. And in Cahokia is where we really appreciate the ceremonial mounds were built around an open courtyard or plaza. They were council houses for elite warriors. These were medicine specialists, religious leaders, other heads of activities or social units were situated. The plazas or courtyards were used for games and ceremonies. Towns varied in size with an average of 300 to 500 people per town. A population of 1,000 would have indicated a major town, while sites like Cahokia, Itawa, and Aztlan had populations from 2,000 to 5,000, with Cahokia at its peak anywhere from 10,000 to 25,000. So there's much activity occurring in the Mississippian region. There are major ceremonial celebrations that occurred during the solstices and equinoxes. There was a trade of raw materials and manufactured goods that helped produce and integrate the surrounding societies. Again, as I shared with you, the people were multilingual and they traveled along well-established land and water routes. The societies had a large, well-organized warfare program. Towns and villages were fortified. Warfare was a means of defeating enemies, but rarely as a means of acquiring territory. In slavery, whenever you have warfare, that means you have societies that have been subdued as a result of violence, and they are enslaved, and they're acquired as a result of war and used to control people in neighboring societies and used for surplus labor projects. So let's go to a film clip that helps us appreciate Cahokia so that we can understand something about the Mississippian cultures.
If only we could go back in time, we might unravel the mystery of this place. How it was planned, how it was built, what it meant to its people. Now we can see only hints of all that was Cahokia. A huge mound, the largest earthen monument in the Americas, and a vast series of smaller mounds arranged in patterns across the largest archaeological site north of Mexico. There is no other place like Cahokia. We're still learning its secrets, and they point to a far-reaching enterprise, to a people who had a vision for what they would build, and to a city like no other in its time. The valley was rich, naturally abundant. Its fertile soil, laid down by the continent's mightiest river, was hospitable to a vast range of plant species. The river, its floodplain, and the nearby bluffs provided several different habitats for a wide variety of animals. It also became a habitat for human beings who migrated into the area over 12,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, the people here evolved into a culture we call Mississippian. These were the men and women who built the mounds. Like earlier people, they grew squash, sunflowers, and other seed-bearing crops. Wild plants, fish, and other animals were also important food, but the fuel for their great enterprise was agriculture. When Mississippian communities started growing corn, for example, they could produce more food than they needed, a surplus. Corn grew well here. Crop yields were high. Because corn could be stored for long periods, some could be saved for years when crops were poor. With a steady food supply, great numbers of people could make Cahokia their permanent home. Mississippians could also exchange surplus crops for meat, tools, clothing, or other items. This meant some people didn't have to farm. They could specialize in other activities, such as tool making. So corn and other crops became more than food. They fueled a whole society. The leader might demand a share of corn to use for a variety of purposes. His emissaries might trade their community's surplus for rare and exotic goods, such as copper or seashells. Mississippian communities traded in this way over a network that spanned thousands of miles, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Ozarks. All of these communities were part of the Mississippian tradition. The larger ones built massive, flat-topped mounds, huge platforms of earth where temples or other buildings were erected. In the American Bottom region, where the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers converge, there was an even more closely linked network. Small communities, some consisting of just a few houses planted at the edge of a cornfield, were linked to larger villages, which were themselves linked to still larger communities, some with thousands of residents. At the center of them all was Cahokia. Cahokia, the great mounds, the vast ceremonial plazas, houses as far as the eye could see. Cahokia. It was the seat of power, of vitality, of wealth, of security. It prevailed for several hundred years. Cahokia. Its many parts were sited with great and deliberate precision. Each area had a function. There were enormous plazas for games, ceremonies, and great gatherings. There were miles of stockade wall protecting the central ceremonial area. There was a unique sun calendar that we call Woodhenge. There were fields of corn and other crops vast enough to feed up to 20,000 inhabitants and produce a surplus. There were immense pits, and from these earth for the mounds was dug. There were ridge-top mounds marking the city's boundaries. There were flat-top mounds where buildings stood, and there were conical burial mounds. And there was one mound, greater than all the others, greater than any other structure in the whole Mississippian world. This great platform of earth was at the center of the community. It was the highest point and the home of the chief.
Okay, so that's the Mississippian cultures. And the Mississippian cultures were very important because as they established themselves coming out of the Ohio, eventually those civilizations are going to get in touch with central Mexico vis-a-vis the Southwest or along the Gulf. And most importantly, they'll be in touch with South America through the Caribbean islands as they jump the islands all the way down towards Venezuela and Colombia today. So we will continue with the desert cultures in our next segment.